All right, welcome to the second half of our summer series. We started this last week on representing buyers in a shifted market. And I'm going to jump back into the next slide in a second. I'm actually going to be conducting this webinar alone. Head coach for Pura Vida Coaching, Stephanie Combs, is actually at a meeting off-site and unavailable this morning. But I'm going to continue on what we started last week and run through why it's important, quickly recap what we covered last week, and then dig into these 5 rules for success in working with buyers. And conceptually, what I want you to be thinking about is as a market shifts in favor of one party or the other, the opposing party becomes the more difficult representation. So in a buyer's market, the challenge is working with sellers. In a seller's market, of which most local markets have shifted either moderately or extremely towards sellers' favor, and that is a low inventory market, multiple offers, and a lot of price ranges, it becomes more challenging to represent a buyer. So with that as our framework, we're going to talk about how to efficiently work with buyers. We had rule number 1 we went through part of last week and got most of the way through this slide. But the quick recap is the reason that in rule number 1 having standards is so important is without standards, your level of efficiency, your ability to successfully work with buyers will decline. It'll do that for a couple of reasons. One, if you don't have a minimum price point, your earnings per hour are going to be very, very low based on the fact that it takes the same number of hours to work with a $1 million buyer as it does a $100,000 buyer. Now, it doesn't matter based on your price points in your market, absolutely. You need to also look at price points from the standpoint of whether or not there's a favorable market conditions. For example, in one of my markets that I operate in, and I do personal production in Austin, below 200,000 in most geographical areas, the price points are so out of balance that you will in fact see as many as 15 offers in the first 12 to 24 hours. I have chosen to not operate in the sub $200,000 price point because it's just not effective. But when I did try this earlier this year, I had buyers giving up, buyers getting frustrated, having to write 5, 6, 7 offers with a great buyer that's fully pre-approved, and then losing 5 times in a row, 6 times in a row. So it's definitely something that you need to choose your minimum price point. We talked a little bit last week about relocation versus local buyers purchasing. If you're working with a local buyer purchasing in the next 60 days, you need to absolutely make sure that you're working with people that are going to purchase in the short term. 2 reasons for this. One, the markets move so quickly on a local basis that they, in fact, may be looking at property that's not even representative of what it would be if, for example, they aren't going to purchase for 4 to 6 months. I caution buyers that are further out, for example, with relocation buyers, to look for areas and types of housing, not trying to actually find the perfect house. Because if somebody's relocating and they're not going to be moving in the market for months, all of the property for most markets in the country will in fact be sold before they get back into the market. So what I want you to be thinking about is setting proper expectations if they're not looking in a short time frame. The majority of your buyers, especially local buyers, should be looking in the next 60 days. Define geographical areas you serve. We touched on this last week. You need to basically figure out who you're going to refer out, what areas you're going to serve, and what areas you're going to pass off and not work with. We talked about working with lenders and buyers that have homes to sell. You should only be working with pre-approved buyers, and you should be working very, very closely with your lender. I have a call or a meeting with my lender every week, and we go through the pipeline and for pre-approvals. I even on my listings will have my lender potentially look at talking to the buyer agents if they're having challenges with their pre-approval process or I don't like the lender they came in with. The have a home to sell is a great buyer. In other words, if you have a listing, that's a great buyer if they're going to be moving up or moving down or buying something else in the same area. Essentially, it becomes 2 pieces of business with the same client. We touched on last time knowing their why. It needs to be a strong why on the buy side to succeed in this market. They can't be easily frustrated. They can't be somebody who's going to give up quickly or have bad expectations relative to the market conditions. And the last 2 bullets, and I'm going to get into the next rule, are meeting with all parties. Sometimes this isn't possible with relocation clients. You certainly want to do it in every opportunity that you have from day one, certainly with local clients. Coach Stephanie talked about last week that sometimes with first-time buyers, they've got aunts, uncles, parents involved, other parties that are going to help advise them. Maybe you're giving them money towards a down payment, so they feel quite a bit of allegiance to them. You need to involve them in the process from day one. And then willing to sign your agreement. And this is not just a buyer agency agreement. You absolutely should have a buyer agency agreement with every buyer you're working with. But beyond that, willing to sign your agreement is some sort of a buyer loyalty agreement. So you lay out what you're willing to do, and I know Stephanie talked last week about getting a copy of an agreement available for you, and if you're interested in that, you should email her, because I know she'll have that buyer loyalty agreement available for anybody who's interested in it. But it's laying out a respective party's duties and expectations. What do you expect out of the buyer? What's going to happen in the process of working with you, and what are you committed to do for them? It's establishing a measure of loyalty in terms of working with you. So let's jump into the next rule. And in Rule 2, we talk about being the market expert. Know your numbers. There's no faster way than to get in trouble with a buyer by not understanding market conditions. You absolutely have to understand the supply and demand. You have to understand the dynamic, how fast are things selling. Are you expected to see multiple offers? Is a typical home on the market for X number of days? Is it 24 hours or is it 200 days? You have to be able to convey this, and there's a timing issue here. You need to know how to explain this from a supply and demand standpoint, and you have to do that up front so that buyers have a proper expectation of the market. There's a dynamic that occurs when you explain this too late in the process. I'll give you two scenarios. Scenario A is when you do your initial buyer consultation, you sit down and you talk about supply and demand in your market and supply and demand in their price range. You go through these 4 or 5 numbers that are critical. Overall actives in your market, actives in their price range. How many deals are pending in their price range versus pending in the overall market? How many closings have there been in the last 30 days? I also talk about closings in the last 6 months. The one thing I also talk about is pendings in the last 30 days. It's an additional one, which will give you 5 bullet points here, and then a list of sales price ratios. So now imagine you're sitting down in that first scenario. You explain all this to a buyer, and they object to it or they have questions about it. You're going to have a more productive conversation in this scenario about figuring out, number one, if you want to work with the buyer, and number two, are they realistic and are they going to be able to purchase in the market? Imagine they came from a market that is not like your local market. They think they can get 10, 15% off. They can lowball things. They think they're going to have plenty of time to look, and things are not selling quickly. And your market's like mine in Austin, and in their price range, multiple offers are the norm. Things are selling for list price and sometimes over with plenty of offers. Here's how I explain that without having to tell them that their expectations are unrealistic. For example, in that, what I talked about earlier, in the number of actives, I can give you an example. I looked at this recently for, say, around a $250,000 property in Austin. There were, say, 50 actives in the area that I was looking at. Now, that sounds like there's a lot of property to choose from. Now, when I looked at the pendings and pendings that were taking backup, there were 73 houses in contract. So at the pace of which they were selling, there were more deals pending than there were active. And the 30-day number was bigger than the number of actives, which pretty much said almost every listing sells in the first 30 days, if not significantly faster. Now, when you get to a comparative market analysis at the local level, you can actually get into their local market. And I've done this recently with a buyer that came in from a poor market right up front, and I asked them, they were from Ohio, what do you think, based on looking at these numbers, that your expectations should be? And he looked at me and said, well, my initial impression was I was going to have plenty of time to look at property. Now what this tells me is there's a little more buyers than available properties, and things are selling almost immediately. That was what he said to me, not I said to him. So I want you to think about the dynamic of how you explain this. Now in scenario B, what I want you to think about is I wait. I don't have that conversation up front. And then when I do have the conversation occurs right before we go ready to make an offer. I show a comparative market analysis, what things are selling for in the neighborhood, and there's 3 or 4 sales in there that we can look at that are relative, and now the buyer pushes back and says, well, that's those 3 or 4 sales. I don't know if that's really the market. Now you're trying to throw data at them, and the risk you run is that the buyer is going to think that you have commission breath. You're thinking about your commission, not their best interests. That does not occur under scenario A when you're just trying to explain market conditions. Now, are you every once in a while going to run into a buyer that balks at that? Our recommendation is in scenario A, where you're explaining it right up front, if they won't buy into market conditions, remember you have standards who you're going to work with, don't work with them. We've seen scenario after scenario of people that won't buy into what market conditions are. And because they don't buy into market conditions, those agents that work with them get burnt. The buyer basically never buys anything, or they make them write lowball offers, and it's a nightmare to work with them. So our suggestion is that you, in fact, do not work with buyers who are unrealistic and don't buy into market conditions. These 4 or 5 numbers, including the pendings in the last 30 days, are what we expect that you should be able to explain and explain in detail. Coach Stephanie has a report, which is the kind that I used when I operated in St. Louis. I currently use in the Austin market. It works extremely well. It's called a Total Market Overview, and she'd be happy to show you a copy of that and talk with you about how that is utilized. All right, rule number 3. This is getting into some fun things, because this is a fast and easy way to really get credible with your buyer and really get expert at understanding market conditions. You need to be looking at homes and looking at them in person. And this is previewing, not looking at them over the internet. Some agents will push back, and I've heard this again and again and again, about the fact that with today's technology and virtual tours, why do I need to run through a house? Well, there is something about understanding a dynamic of a neighborhood, and you see the example here about cracks in basements. You see things that are avoided in photographs like power towers and other things in maybe an unsightly neighborhood where a lot of the houses are not very well kept. You're not going to get that unless you go look at property. The other thing you may decide to do, if you follow our advice, is to go look at every property in a neighborhood, not just the one you think your buyer might be interested in, because who knows, the next week you might get a call from another buyer, and that buyer would be a better fit for the property that maybe needed a little bit of work versus the one that is all completely remodeled. And now you can talk about the entire neighborhood and every property that's available there like an expert. If you do this over the internet, then you're going to run into a problem. Where you're really going to run into a problem is if you take a listing in an area, now you're picking up buyers, and another potential seller who's also looking to buy in that area, and a lot of master plan communities, people move within the community, starts to ask you questions about properties, and it's a test. And if you haven't physically been in the properties or driven the neighborhood or spent time in these areas, you're going to get burned. You're going to miss out on a listing opportunity. You're going to miss out on a buyer who's like, you know, I drove by there, and this agent obviously has not been in this house, so I'm not going to work with them. And this is what happens. Buyers are looking to basically disqualify you or a property or both in a conversation. And we suggest when you're previewing properties, you should set a goal of 20 houses a week. I can preview, and most of Stephanie's coaching clients are taught to preview in 3 to 5 minutes, depending on the size of the house. It's quick look at the front yard, quick look at the key areas, which would be obviously the master bedroom and bath, the kitchen, any of the areas. If it has a basement, you're going to in and out of that basement, especially if the basement is unfinished, in probably less than a minute. You're looking for cracks if it's unfinished or any other issues there and the issues for buyers. You poke your head out, maybe spend 15 or 20 seconds in the backyard. You don't do what buyers do. You're not opening the refrigerator, cabinets, all the different areas, going through everything. You're going to be in and out fairly quickly. This allows you to preview 20 to 25 houses in a week very, very easily, and it's not going to take you a whole lot of time. If you think about dedicating 100 minutes a week, you're not talking about a lot of time plus drive time. And you always want to get the same price point and geography so that you're looking at apples to apples. Do not go on Tuesday tour with your office. It takes too much time. There's too much nonsense there. You got potential to be around too many negative people. And you're looking at non-like kind properties. You're not looking at ranches at $250,000 that buyers would look at, right? They've got a $500,000 house and a $150,000 house. One's a ranch, one's got a basement, one is a two-story. They're not apples to apples, and you don't get a good idea about value or like-kind properties. And you want to give as much feedback as you can when you're asked about it with the listing agent. You want to set that professional expectation because what comes around goes around. You never know when you've got a listing and one of those agents will be showing your listing, and they're going to remember whether you set the precedent for giving prompt and complete feedback. All right, we're going to get into rule number 4 now. And with buyers, if you're going to succeed, you want to ask lots of questions. In Pura Vida, head coach Stephanie uses a defined buyer script that is a multiple-part buyer consultation and setting of expectations. There are a lot of questions in there. Those of you that are in coaching will know this because you've seen all the questions. It is designed to build credibility, to help disqualify buyers that are not going to be realistic, and to help you demonstrate your expertise in handling buyers and understanding the market. And you need to basically know 3 things before the end of your appointment. Their how, in other words, how they're going to purchase, their when, and their why. You know, in other words, are they paying all cash or are they getting financing? What is their current situation? Do they have a house to sell or do they not have a house to sell? Their timing and their why. And I would back up on the timing issue and say you should not be meeting with people that you haven't followed that initial assessment script over the phone and understand the when. I would say if it's not an immediate thing, they're in your target area and they have a house to sell, it's definitely worthwhile getting in front of them and getting them locked down as far as what their plans are to sell their house. Now the why, we talked about this in step 1, is probably the most critical. You're looking for people with solid motivation. You don't want people that have wishy-washy whys that will fall into the, we're just going to renew our lease if we can't find the perfect home, or we've been looking for a year and a half and we're looking to steal something. You need a solid why. As we talked about last week, it could be somebody that says, I'm getting a divorce. The court's going to make us sell the house. Our family is expanding. My wife's pregnant with twins. We won't fit into our current house. We need my mother-in-law to move in with us. Therefore, we won't all fit in this house, and we absolutely have to do that. Putting her into assisted living is not an option for us. Those are examples of great, solid whys. Now, moving on to Rule 5, this is drilling down on the lending side of things. And this is a bone that Stephanie and I and many have with the Realtor Associations. They'll put out all sorts of blog posts and messaging about you trying to explain all sorts of things about the mortgage market. The mortgage market is not what you want to demonstrate being an expert in. The client, as a buyer or a seller that is then going to look to buy, is looking for you to be a real estate expert and a market expert on real estate. They expect that you will have a specialist you work with that's a lender. Now that said, you should know enough about the mortgage market to handle basic questions, but your lender should be heavily involved as quickly as possible right up front. They should be an integral part of the process, and it should be a normal part of the process. And I can tell you what I do, and I've disqualified clients that will not even talk with my lender, especially if they're working with one of the large lenders or the online lenders. I just won't work with them. And I will say, I'd like Matt to call you and talk with you about your personal financial situation and make sure you've got some great options. And if they've already been pre-approved, I'll say, now for example, I know you've talked with your credit union or your bank. What Matt will be able to do is he'll be able to validate whether you have great rate and terms as far as your existing pre-approval. And if not, he'll probably be able to offer you even better pricing and terms. And there's no cost for this. Would it be better to have Matt call you right after we hang up, or is there a specific time he should call you later today? I rarely have anybody object to this. And you're not asking for permission for the lender to call him versus, is it okay if I have Matt call you? Would it be all right if we took a look at your situation? You know, you don't want to be basically groveling for an opportunity. Don't give him the name of your lender. In other words, here's Matt's phone number. Can you give him a call? That doesn't happen, right? That takes the onus off of them. And you need to have an expectation with your lender that if you text and say, I've set an appointment with John Smith for 2 o'clock this afternoon, I need you to call them right away and make sure that they're pre-approved. Your lender has to understand that with rare exceptions, they're going to hit the time, and they're going to follow up with many phone calls and enough follow-up to actually make that happen. And you want to do this regularly as your process. You want to do it aggressively, because this is where you run into problems. I have a listing here in Austin where a buyer is excited as could be to buy it, and the agent told me that they're working with Wells Fargo. I'm not picking on Wells Fargo, but this is what these national lenders do. And they're not going to issue them a pre-approval until next week until they physically make a deposit in their savings account to show for the balance of the down payment. They're so stringent on what they do. And in this case, I've offered to have Matt, my lender in Austin, have a conversation with them and give them an alternative. They can compare rates and terms and likely not miss out on this property. Then we've had 17 showings on the property. The agent was so pleased with the opportunity to potentially do this that she was ecstatic last night when I proposed it as an option. That's a buyer agent on the other side of a listing. Think about the buyers and harm's way and keeping them out of it. And the last point you see on here is set a 30-minute recurring appointment on your calendar to meet with your lender weekly. This can be a phone call. Better yet, it should be in person where you're building a relationship and talking about your pipeline. Your lender should be your cleanup crew for fixing buyers that need minor to major repair. They should be in charge of putting people in credit repair with somebody that they rely on, and then bring them back to you as a buyer when they're ready. You can do your follow-up as well, but you're not running around trying to figure out how to do that. They should be doing follow-up aggressively on your pipeline of buyers as well. So this was a quick 25-minute review on part 2 here in the summer series of how to work with buyers. We'll be back next week with some continuing content. I want to thank everybody for being on here. We've got a lot of new people on here this week versus have been on here in the past. If you're looking for any of the documentation I mentioned, either that total market overview or any of the other documents, including the buyer consultation, the buyer loyalty agreement, get in touch with Coach Stephanie from Pura Vida Coaching. You can go to puravidacoaching.com. There's a contact button on there. Let her know what you're interested in getting, and she'll follow up with you. I appreciate your time, and you all have a great Friday and weekend. We'll be back next week at the same time.